Tonight, as you settle into the soft comfort of your resting place, we will journey backward through centuries of time to explore one of the world's most remarkable civilizations, the Maya. But before we reveal the full scope of their achievements, consider this. What knowledge did an ancient people possess about the movements of stars and planets so precise that their calendars would astound modern astronomers? How did a civilization without wheels, without beasts of burden, and without metal tools construct sprawling cities of stone in the heart of a tropical forest? And what daily rhythms, customs, and environmental wisdom allowed millions of people to thrive in one of Earth's most demanding landscapes? These questions hang gently in the night air as we begin our exploration, and the answers will unfold slowly, layer by layer, like mist rising from a sacred cenote at dawn. Imagine, for a moment, the Yucatan Peninsula as it existed over 2,000 years ago. The landscape stretches endlessly in shades of emerald and jade, dense forest canopy pressing upward toward a sky so blue it seemed infinite to those who inhabited these lands. The jungle floor remains perpetually damp, thick with the scent of rich earth, decomposing vegetation, and the sweet fragrance of flowers blooming in hidden clearings. The air hangs heavy and warm, even as night descends, carrying the chorus of insects whose rhythmic chirping and buzzing creates a constant, soothing backdrop to life. Birds call to one another through the darkness, the deep, resonant hooting of owls, the sharp cries of parrots, the gentle cooing of doves. Water is everywhere and nowhere. Underground rivers flow through labyrinthine cave systems beneath the forest floor, while sinkholes called cenotes pierce the earth, revealing pools of astonishingly clear water that shimmer like mirrors beneath the canopy. To the Maya, these cenotes were far more than sources of sustenance. They were sacred thresholds between the material world and the realm of the gods, places of pilgrimage and ceremony, where the boundary between visible and invisible worlds grew thin and permeable. In this world, cities rose. Not cities as we might imagine them, not crowded with endless streets of uniform buildings, but rather sacred ceremonial centers connected by raised stone causeways through the forest, surrounded by vast networks of residential areas, agricultural terraces, and water management systems. These cities possessed a rhythm entirely their own, synchronized not to the arbitrary divisions of modern time, but to the movements of celestial bodies and the cycles of the agricultural year. At their hearts stood towering pyramids, palaces adorned with intricate carved stone, ball courts where ritual games played crucial roles in cosmological understanding, and markets where merchants gathered to exchange goods from across vast distances. The Maya civilization, which reached its peak during what scholars call the Classic period, roughly from 250 to 900 of the Common Era, represented one of humanity's great achievements. A complex society built on mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, and a profound spiritual relationship with the natural world. To understand the Maya, we must first understand the land they inhabited and shaped. The territory we now call the Maya world stretched across what is today Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Yet the Maya themselves did not view their civilization as a unified empire in the way we might imagine the Romans or Chinese dynasties. Instead, they understood themselves as a collection of related city-states, each with its own dynastic ruler called a Kuhula Jau, literally divine lord, yet all bound together by shared language, religion, culture, and intricate systems of trade and alliance. The landscape itself reinforced this decentralized structure. Dense jungle and mountain ridges made unified political control difficult, encouraging instead the development of independent centers of power that nonetheless recognized their kinship with distant neighbors. The northern Yucatan Peninsula, where cities like Chichen Itza and Uxmal would rise to prominence, presented a particular set of challenges and opportunities. Here, the limestone bedrock lies relatively close to the surface, creating a landscape marked by minimal water sources above ground. Yet the Maya transformed this apparent disadvantage into an opportunity for remarkable engineering innovation. They constructed elaborate systems of reservoirs and cisterns to capture and store rainwater, cistern systems called aguadas that could sustain large populations through the dry season. Meanwhile, the southern lowlands, where the earlier cities of Tikal, Palenque, and Calakmul flourished, offered abundant rainfall and flowing water sources, but presented different challenges. Dense, disease-ridden jungle, where clearing land required enormous labor and constant maintenance to prevent the forest from reclaiming cultivated areas. The highlands of Guatemala, with their volcanic soils and cooler temperatures, provided yet another distinct environment, one that allowed the cultivation of crops different from those in the lowlands and created opportunities for trade and specialization. This geographical diversity, this patchwork of different environments, each with its own resources and constraints, meant that Maya civilization could never be monolithic. Instead, it was necessarily plural, creative, and adaptive. The foundation of Maya civilization rested on agriculture, and particularly on the cultivation of maize, corn, which filled roughly 70 to 80% of the typical diet. But maize alone could not sustain a civilization. The Maya developed an extraordinarily sophisticated understanding of their environment and how to extract maximum sustenance from it. They cultivated beans, which provided essential proteins and grew naturally alongside maize, their vines climbing the tall stalks in a mutually beneficial relationship. They grew squash, which protected the soil from erosion and conserved moisture. Together, these three crops, maize, beans, and squash, formed the agricultural foundation of Maya life, a combination known as the Three Sisters that provided a complete nutritional profile. Beyond these staples, the Maya cultivated cacao, which held profound cultural and economic significance, vanilla, whose aromatic pods were valued across the known world, honey from native bees, and countless other plants for food, medicine, and ceremonial use. The sophisticated understanding of seasons, soil conditions, water availability, and crop rotation that this required represented a form of knowledge as valuable and precise as any scientific inquiry. The agricultural year structured Maya life in ways both practical and sacred, weaving together the demands of cultivation with the obligations of ceremony and community. As the dry season approached, and we can imagine the forest growing slightly less humid, the incessant buzz of insects perhaps diminishing ever so slightly, farmers prepared for the most critical and dangerous agricultural practice, the milpa system, based on shifting cultivation and the deliberate burning of forest plots to create arable land. This practice, which may seem destructive to modern ears, actually represented a sophisticated form of land management, refined over centuries. A farmer would select a plot of mature forest, carefully choosing the season when moisture content in the vegetation remained relatively low. As the very end of the dry season approached, when the forest was most desiccated and the evening air carried the expectation of returning rain, the farmer would set fire to his chosen plot. The flames would consume the accumulated vegetation in a spectacular conflagration that transformed day into near twilight, filling the air with smoke and ash that drifted across the landscape for days afterward. This burning served multiple crucial purposes. The ash enriched the soil with nutrients, particularly potassium and phosphorus. The destruction of existing vegetation eliminated competition for the new crops that would be planted. The intense heat killed many pests and diseases that might otherwise decimate the young plants. And crucially, the burning occurred at precisely the moment before the rains returned, so that by the time the farmer was ready to plant, the first rains would fall on rich, prepared soil. The farmer would then use a simple wooden planting stick, sharpened at one end, to make holes in the ash-enriched earth. Into each hole, he would place maize kernels with the precision of ritual, along with beans and squash seeds, speaking the words and prayers that accompanied this act of co-creation with the divine. As the rains began, and here we must imagine the first heavy drops falling on the parched earth, the smell of dust and soil rising up to meet them, the temperature dropping as clouds obscured the sun. The seeds would germinate and grow with remarkable speed. Within weeks, the maize plants would tower above a person's head, their tall stalks creating leafy corridors through which farmers moved as they weeded and maintained their crops. The work of the agricultural year was relentless and shared across the entire community. Men performed the heavy labor of clearing and burning, though this work was often accompanied by ritual specialists who offered prayers and ceremonies to ensure the success of the endeavor. Women and children participated in planting, weeding, and harvesting. By the time of harvest, which came in the months of November and December in the Maya calendar, the entire community mobilized for the urgent work of gathering the ripe maize before pests, birds, or unexpected weather could damage the crop. Families worked from dawn to dusk, their hands blackening from the dried corn silk, their backs aching from the repetitive motions of removing ears from stalks. The harvest itself was treated as a sacred occasion, worthy of ceremony and thanksgiving. The first ears of corn were presented to the local religious authority with prayers of gratitude. Only after these ceremonial obligations were fulfilled could the practical work of storing the harvest begin. As we slowly transition our attention from the forest and fields to the constructed world of Maya settlement, we encounter one of the most fascinating aspects of Maya civilization: the intricate relationship between urban space, settlement patterns, and the underlying cosmological beliefs that shaped how the Maya understood the universe. The typical pattern of Maya settlement was not, contrary to what early European observers believed, centered entirely on the grand pyramids and palaces visible at the ceremonial heart of a city. Rather, these monumental buildings were embedded within a much larger and more complex urban landscape. Around the central plaza, that open ceremonial space dominated by pyramids, palaces, and smaller temple structures, lay networks of smaller residential compounds and smaller shrines. Further outward, gradually transitioning into the forest, were the homes of the common people. Modest structures built on low platforms of stone, typically composed of a framework of wooden posts lashed together with vines, the walls made of wattle and daub, thin wooden branches interwoven and then covered with mud that hardened in the sun. The roofs were thatched with palm fronds, a technique that remains in use in Maya communities even today, creating structures that were cool, practical, and well adapted to the tropical climate. These residential structures, modest though they might appear to an outside observer, were nonetheless carefully positioned and organized according to principles that reflected the Maya understanding of cosmic order. The typical residential compound consisted of one or more of these simple houses arranged around a central courtyard where daily domestic activities took place: cooking, crafting, family gatherings. The orientation of buildings, their positioning relative to cardinal directions, and their relationship to water sources all reflected underlying cosmological principles. The four cardinal directions held enormous significance in Maya thought. The east, where the sun rose, was associated with life and the color red. The west, where the sun set, was associated with death and the color black. The north was associated with the color white and the realm of the ancestors. And the south, often associated with the color yellow, held connections to agriculture and growth. These orientations were not arbitrary aesthetic choices, but rather reflections of deeply held beliefs about how the terrestrial world mirrored the organization of the cosmos. The monumental buildings at the center of Maya cities revealed even more elaborate expressions of cosmological knowledge and religious belief. The pyramids themselves, known in Spanish as pyramides, but which the Maya themselves would have understood as mountains, and indeed they often referred to them by a word meaning formation of stone, represented the world mountain, the axis mundi that connected the underworld below, the terrestrial realm of humans, and the heavenly realms above. To climb the steep staircases that ascended these pyramids was thus to undertake a spiritual journey, moving upward through the layers of existence toward the divine realm. At the summit of these pyramids stood temples, typically small, dark chambers entered through narrow doorways. These chambers were not meant for congregational worship as modern religious spaces might be, but rather served as locations where the divine and human realms could intersect. Here, the Kuhul Ajau and the priestly class would perform the elaborate ceremonies and bloodletting rituals that they believed maintained the cosmic order and prevented the world from descending into chaos. Now, gently shifting our focus toward one of the most astonishing achievements of Maya civilization, we must contemplate their understanding of time itself. The Maya developed multiple, overlapping calendar systems, each tracking different cycles and rhythms. The most familiar to scholars is the Tzolk'in, a 260-day calendar that appears to have been based on the human gestation period and tracked a combination of 13 numerals and 20 named days. This calendar served as the basis for Maya astrology and destiny. A person's position in the Tzolk'in determined fundamental aspects of their personality and fate. Every 20-day period, called a uinal, or sometimes a winal, carried its own significance and associations with different aspects of life: agriculture, warfare, ceremony, craft production. Each of these 20-day periods was named for a particular deity or cosmic principle. Alongside this 260-day calendar, the Maya also used the Hab, a 365-day calendar based on the solar year, comprising 18 named months of 20 days each, plus an additional unnamed period of 5 days considered especially dangerous and inauspicious. The combination of these two calendars, the 260-day Tzolk'in and the 365-day Hab, created a larger cycle of 52 years, a period the Maya called the calendar round. Every 52 years, the two calendars aligned in precisely the same way they had 52 years before, and this moment was celebrated with elaborate ceremonies that expressed deep anxiety about the continuation of the cosmos. Would the sun rise again? would the world continue? These ceremonies of renewal, as scholars have termed them, appear to have involved the extinction and rekindling of sacred fires, ceremonies of bloodletting, and public performances that reassured the community that yes, the cosmos would continue, the sun would rise, the cycle would turn once more. But the Maya were not content with these calendrical systems alone. They also tracked the movements of Venus with astonishing precision. The planet Venus, visible as the morning star and evening star depending on the season, held particular significance in Maya cosmology, associated with war and sacrifice. The Dresden Codex, one of the few pre-Columbian Maya texts to survive the Spanish conquest, contains detailed astronomical tables for tracking Venus's movements across a period of 236 years, with corrections so precise that modern astronomers have verified their accuracy. The appearance of Venus at particular times in the calendar was believed to presage wars, victories, and the deaths of rulers. Similar attention was paid to the movements of Mars, which also held martial associations. The night sky, in other words, was not a distant realm of abstract beauty to the Maya, but rather a cosmic calendar and divination tool, a record of divine will written in the movements of celestial bodies. The long count calendar, another sophisticated tracking system, counted days from a mythological creation date that scholars place as equivalent to August 11th, 3114 BCE in our modern calendar. Unlike the 260-day and 365-day calendars, which cycled endlessly, the long count was a linear tracking system that moved inexorably forward, recording the passage of time from the mythological beginning of the current world. By the classic period height of Maya civilization, the long count date would have been in the 800s and 900s, meaning that nearly 5,000 years had passed since the mythological creation. This long count system allowed Maya scribes to record historical events with precision. The accession of a new ruler, the completion of a building project, a military victory, a royal marriage. These dates were recorded on stone monuments called stelae and altars, creating a historical record that, while fragmentary, nonetheless represents one of the few non-alphabetic writing systems from the pre-Columbian Americas to have been substantially deciphered in modern times. As night deepens and we settle more deeply into our exploration of Maya civilization, it is important to understand how the Maya recorded and transmitted knowledge through their unique writing system. The Maya script was a sophisticated combination of logographic and syllabic elements, meaning that individual signs could represent whole words or concepts, while other signs represented syllables that could be combined to spell out words phonetically. This system allowed considerable flexibility and elegance in how Maya scribes recorded their language. The most important texts were inscribed in stone, on stelae and altars, on the walls of temples, on palace facades. These permanent records were intended to endure for eternity, preserving dynastic records, religious teachings, and historical narratives for future generations to read and venerate. Yet the most portable form of Maya writing was the bark paper manuscript, or codex, made from the inner bark of certain trees pounded into a thin, smooth sheet, and then folded in accordion-like sections. These precious manuscripts were painted with elaborate hieroglyphic texts and brilliant illustrations rendered in mineral-based pigments, brilliant blues and reds derived from minerals, black from charcoal, white from gypsum or lime. Unfortunately, very few of these codices survived the Spanish conquest and the centuries that followed. The climate of the Maya lands, with its high humidity and abundant moisture, was extraordinarily hostile to paper preservation, and many codices were deliberately destroyed by Spanish friars who viewed them as records of pagan belief and practice. Yet the handful that survived, the Dresden Codex, the Paris Codex, the Madrid Codex, and fragments of others, provide invaluable insights into Maya mathematical, astronomical, and religious knowledge. These codices were not meant for mass distribution, but rather served as reference materials for the priestly and scribal class who possessed the knowledge and skill to interpret their intricate contents. The ability to read and write in this complex script was a mark of high status in Maya society. Scribes, known as Ajat Sibab, or those of the writing, were highly valued members of the elite, often depicted in art wearing distinctive clothing and ornaments that marked their profession. They worked for the Kuhulajau and the noble families, recording dynastic histories, astronomical calculations, and religious texts. To become a scribe required years of training and study, learning not only how to form the hundreds of individual signs that made up the writing system, but also understanding the religious, mathematical, and historical knowledge that gave meaning to those signs. A scribe's work was thus an act of both technical skill and intellectual mastery, a position that granted considerable prestige and influence within Maya society. The social organization of Maya civilization was profoundly hierarchical, dominated by a small elite class connected through blood ties, marriage alliances, and religious authority. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the Kuhul Ajau, the divine king whose authority was believed to be divinely ordained and whose person was considered sacred. The Kuhul Ajau was not merely a political leader, but a cosmic intermediary, a being who stood at the intersection of the human and divine realms. His body was the site where spiritual power concentrated most intensely. His blood possessed regenerative properties believed essential to the continuation of the cosmic order. The legitimacy of a Kuhul Ajau derived not from military conquest alone or inherited wealth alone, but rather from demonstrated connections to divine power and proven ability to maintain cosmic order and ensure agricultural fertility and military success. The succession to the throne of Kuhul Ajau typically followed patterns of patrilineal inheritance, with the position passing from father to son. However, the process was not automatic or guaranteed. A new Kuhul Ajau had to perform rituals and ceremonies that demonstrated his qualification for the role, his connection to the divine, and his ability to maintain the cosmic order. When a ruling Kuhul Ajau died, a period of vulnerability and danger was believed to descend on the kingdom. The transition was marked by elaborate death rituals. The body of the deceased ruler was likely cremated or buried in a tomb within one of the pyramids, accompanied by precious grave goods, including jadeite vessels, painted ceramics, and sometimes the sacrificial remains of followers or captives meant to accompany the deceased ruler into the afterlife. The period between the death of one ruler and the accession of his successor was marked by rituals of renewal and re-establishment, ceremonies designed to demonstrate that the new Kuhul Ajau possessed the spiritual power necessary to continue the cosmic order. Below the Kuhul Ajau in the social hierarchy were the members of the nobility, the Yajau, or subordinate lords, who controlled territories and settlements within the Kuhul Ajau's larger domain. These nobles were typically related to the king through blood or marriage, forming a complex web of kinship ties that bound the political structure together. each noble maintained his own household, his own contingent of administrators and warriors, his own religious specialists. The relationship between the Kuhul Ajau and his subordinate nobles was one of mutual obligation and negotiation. The subordinate nobles owed loyalty and tribute to their overlord, while the overlord had certain responsibilities to provide military protection, adjudicate disputes, and maintain the rituals necessary to ensure continued prosperity. When the authority of a Kuhul Ajau weakened due to military defeats, failure of harvests, or perceived loss of divine favor, subordinate nobles might break away, forming independent centers of power or allying with rival kingdoms. The political history of the Maya Classic period was thus marked by constant shifts in alliance, periods of consolidation under powerful rulers, and periods of fragmentation when no single authority could command the loyalty of all surrounding territories. Beneath the nobility, but above the common people, stood another crucial category of elite, the religious specialists, the priests and shamans, who mediated between the human and divine realms. These individuals spent years studying the sacred calendars, learning the mythology and cosmology that gave order and meaning to existence, mastering the rituals and ceremonies that maintained cosmic balance. The role of these religious specialists was extraordinarily complex and multifaceted. They served as astronomers, observing and calculating the movements of celestial bodies, and using this knowledge to predict solar and lunar eclipses, the heliacal rising of Venus, and other significant astronomical events. They served as healers, using plant-based medicines and ritual practices to treat illness and injury. They served as judges and arbiters of moral disputes. They served as shamans, undertaking visionary journeys, often facilitated through the use of psychoactive substances, to communicate with the spirit world and bring back knowledge and healing power. And they served as performers of the elaborate ceremonies that marked the passage of time, the changing of seasons, and the significant events in the life of the Kuhul Ajau and the kingdom. One particular category of religious practice that played a central role in Maya ritual was bloodletting, or chab. This practice, which seems shocking to modern sensibilities, was understood by the Maya as a form of sacred reciprocity. Just as the cosmos required nurture and maintenance, just as crops required water and sun to grow, so too did the gods require sustenance in the form of blood. The blood of the Kuhul Ajau was understood to be particularly potent, infused with divine power. During important ceremonies, the Kuhul Ajau would perform ritual bloodletting, typically by drawing blood from his own genitals, using obsidian blades or stingray spines. The blood would be soaked into strips of bark paper, which would then be burned, the rising smoke believed to communicate directly with the gods and ancestors. Royal women also participated in bloodletting ceremonies, drawing blood from their tongues or other body parts. These acts, though physically painful, were understood as sacred obligations, as necessary sacrifices that maintained the cosmic order and ensured the continued prosperity and stability of the kingdom. Large-scale sacrificial rituals, particularly those involving human sacrifice, appear to have been reserved for the most critical moments, the accession of a new Kuhul Ajau during periods of severe crisis, such as prolonged drought or military threat, and possibly at the completion of important calendrical cycles like the 52-year calendar round. The victims in these rituals were typically war captives from rival kingdoms, their blood spilled and their bodies disposed of in ways believed to nourish the gods and maintain cosmic balance. The exact frequency and scale of human sacrifice in Maya civilization remains a matter of scholarly debate, with interpretations varying based on the available evidence from artistic depictions, carved inscriptions, and rare skeletal remains that show evidence of ritual violence. What remains clear is that from the perspective of the Maya themselves, these acts were not understood as the kind of violence we might associate with cruelty or brutality, but rather as sacred obligations, as acts of reverence and renewal necessary to maintain the cosmic order upon which all life depended. Let us now turn our attention to the everyday lives of those people whose labor and creativity sustained Maya civilization. The farmers, the merchants, the artisans, and the vast majority of the population who were not part of the elite, but whose lives were nonetheless ordered and structured by the cycles of the calendar, the seasons, and the authority of the Kuhulajau. For most of the population, daily life revolved around agriculture and the endless cycle of cultivation, harvest, and renewal. The day would begin early as the first light began to gray the eastern horizon. Most people rose at dawn, moving quietly through their homes as they prepared for the day's labor. The night air, still cool despite the tropical location, would begin to warm as the sun rose. Men would typically head out to the fields, carrying provisions for the day's work. Perhaps a meal of ground maize prepared by women of the household, wrapped in corn husks and carried in baskets. Women would remain closer to the residential compound, engaged in the endless work of processing maize, grinding the cooked kernels into masa, the fine flour that was the basis for tortillas and other staple foods. The process of grinding maize was extraordinarily labor-intensive. The kernels would first be boiled with a small amount of lime, calcium hydroxide, a process known as nixtamalization that both softened the kernels and increased the nutritional value of the resulting flour by making certain nutrients more bioavailable to the human body. The cooked, softened kernels would then be ground against a stone quern or metate using a handheld stone tool called a mano, a repetitive motion that could consume several hours each day. The resulting masa would be shaped by hand into thin, flat tortillas that were cooked on a large pottery disc called a comal, heated over the fire. The characteristic smell of corn tortillas cooking, a warm, toasted grain aroma that filled the morning air, would have been a constant feature of the sensory environment of Maya settlements. These tortillas were typically eaten with beans, cooked until soft and often flavored with chilies, creating a combination that provided complete protein and remained the foundation of the Maya diet as it remains today. Beyond the primary work of agriculture and food processing, the residential compound was the site of numerous other productive activities. Pottery making was typically performed by women, who shaped vessels from clay using hand-building techniques, forming them without the wheel, which was absent from pre-Columbian Americas. These vessels varied enormously in form and function. Large storage jars for keeping maize and other foodstuffs, cooking pots designed to withstand fire without cracking, serving bowls for communal meals, specialized vessels for ritual purposes decorated with hieroglyphic texts and scenes from mythology. The work of making these vessels was precise and skillful, requiring years of practice and experience to master. The clay would be shaped, allowed to slowly dry until it reached the correct consistency, and then carefully fired in an open kiln, with the potter watching carefully to ensure proper temperature and preventing the destructive cracking that could ruin hours of work. The painted designs that adorned the finest vessels required artistic skill and knowledge of mythology and cosmology to produce correctly. Textile production was another crucial economic activity, typically performed by women using backstrap looms in which one end of the loom was attached to a wooden post and the other end to the weaver's waist. The weaver could adjust tension on the loom by leaning forward or backward, using this movement combined with handheld weaving implements to create intricate patterns and designs. The colors used in these textiles came from natural dyes. Indigo produced brilliant blues. Cochineal insects produced reds and purples. Various plants produced yellows and browns. The finest textiles were works of remarkable artistry, incorporating complex geometric patterns and sometimes depicting scenes from mythology or daily life. These textiles served multiple functions. They were worn as clothing, traded as valuable commodities, and used in ceremonies and rituals. The finest cotton textiles were luxury goods, valued by the elite and traded across considerable distances, serving as visible markers of wealth and status. Obsidian working was another crucial craft, typically performed by specialized artisans who had trained for years to master the techniques. Obsidian, a volcanic glass with an edge finer than modern steel, was traded from its source areas in the highlands of Guatemala and Mexico to lowland Maya cities at considerable distances. The artisans who worked with obsidian created not only practical tools like blades and blades, but also decorative objects like mirrors, ornaments, and items used in ritual contexts. The process of working obsidian required exceptional skill. The raw material had to be fractured in just the right way to produce useful flakes, and achieving the correct angle and force to produce both useful tools and beautiful objects required years of practice and a deep understanding of the material's properties. The trade networks that carried these goods across the Maya world and beyond were extensive and complex, connecting the Maya civilization with distant regions. Cacao, which the Maya cultivated and valued highly, was traded with peoples in central Mexico. Obsidian flowed down from highland sources to lowland cities. Marine goods like shells and fish materials moved inland from coastal communities. These trade networks were not impersonal mercantile systems as we might imagine modern commerce, but rather networks of relationship and obligation, often structured through kinship ties and gift exchange rather than pure monetary transaction. The merchants who facilitated this trade, known in the Maya language as Pochteca or sometimes Polom, occupied an interesting position in Maya society. They were not part of the nobility, yet they often traveled far and possessed knowledge and connections that granted them considerable influence and prestige. Some evidence suggests that merchants may have served double roles as spies or diplomatic envoys for their home kingdoms, making them valued and sometimes feared figures in the Maya world. Now, let us drift our attention toward the monumental cities themselves, the great ceremonial centers that dominated the landscape and served as the focal points of Maya civilization. Consider Tikal, one of the largest and most important Maya cities, situated in the rainforests of what is now Guatemala. At its height during the Classic period, Tikal covered an area of roughly 575 square kilometers, with a central ceremonial precinct of perhaps 2 square kilometers, dominated by enormous pyramids and palace structures, surrounded by suburban residential zones and smaller temples and shrines spread across the broader landscape. The most impressive structure at Tikal is Temple 4. a pyramid that rose to a height of perhaps 65 meters, taller than the Statue of Liberty, making it one of the tallest pre-Columbian structures in the Americas. To climb to the summit of this structure required ascending steep staircases that seem almost impossibly steep to modern eyes, each step perhaps a third of a meter high, creating a staircase that resembled more an assault on the vertical than a leisurely ascent. The effort required to climb to the temple on top suggested intentionality and reverence. You would not casually climb this staircase. The construction of these massive structures required extraordinary feats of engineering and organization. The stones, quarried from nearby limestone sources using simple stone tools, had to be transported to the building site, a process requiring enormous labor and ingenious systems of levers, ramps, and human muscle. The stones had to be fitted precisely, with minimal gaps between them, using only gravity and careful placement to hold them in place. No mortar was used in the construction of Maya temples and pyramids. The precision achieved through this dry stone construction is remarkable. Many of the structures have survived earthquakes and centuries of exposure to the tropical environment without significant degradation. The construction of a major pyramid or palace complex would have required coordination of thousands of workers over many years, under the direction of architects and engineers who understood principles of geometry, balance, and load distribution with sufficient precision to ensure that the finished structures would stand for centuries. Around the central ceremonial precinct of Tikal and other major cities lay networks of smaller structures, including residential compounds for the nobility, smaller temples and shrines associated with particular deities or ceremonies, ball courts where the sacred ball game was played, and structures associated with administrative functions and craft production. The ball courts, in particular, represented important elements of Maya cities. These structures consisted of two parallel stone walls with sloped inner surfaces, with an open area in the center where the game was played. The ball game, called Pok-to-Pok in the Yucatec Maya language, was a ritual sport with profound religious and political significance. Two teams, composed of noble warriors, or sometimes including the Kuhul Ajau himself, would compete to direct a solid rubber ball through a stone ring positioned high on one of the walls using only their hips, thighs, and shoulders, never their hands or feet. The game required tremendous athleticism and skill, and the victor was believed to gain prestige and the favor of the gods. In some cases, the losing captain in important matches played for his life. Certain inscriptions and artistic depictions suggest that the stakes of the most important games included the lives of the losers. While Tikal represents the largest and most architecturally impressive of the Maya cities, other centers like Palenque present a different expression of Maya architectural achievement. Located in what is now Mexico, Palenque rose to prominence somewhat later than Tikal, reaching its peak during the 7th and 8th centuries of the Common Era. The city sits in a dramatic location, nestled at the edge of a wide plain, with the jungle rising behind it toward distant mountains. The site, perhaps smaller than Tikal but more densely developed in its central precinct, showcases a distinctive architectural style that emphasizes intricate carving, artistic refinement, and integration with the natural landscape. The Palace of Palenque, a sprawling complex of interconnected structures surrounding several courtyards, represents a masterpiece of Maya architectural design. Rather than being a single monolithic structure, the palace consists of multiple buildings connected through corridors and causeways, creating a complex spatial arrangement that allowed for multiple functions: administrative chambers, residential spaces for the royal family, ritual spaces, and storage areas. The walls are decorated with intricate stucco carvings depicting mythological scenes, dynastic records, and religious concepts, each element carefully positioned and rendered with artistic precision. The Temple of the Inscriptions, another major structure at Palenque, served as the burial shrine of Pakal, one of the city's greatest rulers, who reigned for 68 years during the 7th century. In the temple, archaeologists discovered a corbelled arch vault, a distinctive feature of Maya architecture in which stones are positioned so that their inner edges project progressively inward, eventually meeting at an apex. The corbelled arch was the only true arch form used by the Maya. The Roman arch, with its keystone configuration, never appeared in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. Below the temple chamber, archaeologists found a burial crypt containing the remains of Pakal, a body laden with jade jewelry, surrounded by pottery vessels and other grave goods, the walls decorated with stucco figures and texts providing autobiographical and genealogical information. The artistic quality of the carving in this chamber is extraordinary, with human figures rendered in subtle relief, capturing minute details of clothing, ornament, and facial features. The tomb of Pakal represents one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of Maya civilization, providing crucial information about funerary practices, dynastic succession, and artistic achievement. The artistic depictions at Palenque and other Maya centers reveal much about the aesthetic sensibilities of Maya civilization. The human figures depicted in stone carvings and painted ceramics show an interest in capturing individual characteristics and emotional expressions. The profiles of rulers are rendered with attention to distinctive features that might have served to identify specific historical individuals. Mythological scenes from the sacred narrative known as the Popol Vuh, a creation myth recorded in hieroglyphic texts and later transcribed in phonetic Spanish alphabet by Quiche Maya scholars in the colonial period, appear repeatedly in artistic contexts, suggesting their central importance to the religious worldview. Scenes of bloodletting rituals, human sacrifice, and warfare are depicted with clarity and detail, indicating that these practices were matters of public knowledge and importance, rather than hidden or shameful acts. The ancient Maya were not isolated from other civilizations and cultures in Mesoamerica. Trade networks connected them to peoples far beyond the traditional boundaries of the Maya world. Teotihuacan, a massive city in central Mexico that reached its height around the 5th century of the Common Era, maintained diplomatic and commercial relations with Maya cities. Some scholars believe that Teotihuacan actually established a political presence in certain Maya cities, with rulers bearing names and titles reflecting central Mexican origins. Cacao, highly valued by both the Maya and central Mexican peoples, formed an important basis for this trade. Jade, mined in the Maya highlands, flowed north along trade routes. Obsidian from Mexican sources flowed south into the Maya world. This exchange was not merely material but cultural and intellectual as well. Ideas about religious practices, artistic styles, astronomical concepts, and administrative organization flowed along these same trade routes. The connections with peoples to the north did not begin with Teotihuacan. Archaeological evidence suggests that trade and cultural exchange between the Maya and peoples of central Mexico dated back at least 2,000 years to the formative or pre-classic period, long before the flowering of the classic period cities. During the early classic period, around the 4th century of the Common Era, Teotihuacan appears to have exerted significant influence on Maya political and cultural practices. Some Maya cities adopted artistic styles and architectural forms from Teotihuacan. Military tactics may have been influenced by Central Mexican practices. Religious iconography, particularly symbols associated with warfare and sacrifice, show elements that appear to have Teotihuacan origins. Yet the Maya were not passive recipients of this influence. They adapted and transformed what they received, integrating foreign elements into their own distinctive cultural framework. To the south, the Maya maintained connections with peoples of Central America, particularly the Lenca, and peoples of what is now Honduras and El Salvador. Trade in cacao and other goods created networks of exchange that extended these connections. The Maya concept of divine kingship and the associated cosmological beliefs may have influenced neighboring peoples, while the Maya also adopted certain cultural practices from their neighbors. The jade that the Maya prized so highly came from sources in Guatemala and Honduras, creating economic relationships and presumably also opportunities for cultural exchange and diplomatic contact. The boundaries of the Maya world in archaeological and scholarly contexts are thus somewhat fluid and permeable. There were no hard borders, but rather zones of increasing cultural difference as one moved away from the core areas of Maya settlement and influence. To fully understand the achievements of Maya civilization, we must contemplate the environment in which they lived and the ingenious ways in which they adapted to and shaped their landscape. The tropical rainforest environment of the lowland Maya regions presented both enormous resources and significant challenges. The warm, humid climate supported the growth of an extraordinarily diverse flora and fauna. Hundreds of tree species, many bearing fruit, nuts, or other products useful to human communities. Jaguars and pumas that inspired awe and religious reverence. Deer that provided both meat and hides. Wild boar, tapirs, monkeys, countless bird species, and an extraordinary diversity of insects and other arthropods. The forest canopy rose to heights of 30 meters or more, creating a layered environment with distinct zones. The emergent layer of the tallest trees rising above the main canopy, the middle canopy layer providing food and habitat for countless organisms, the understory of smaller trees and shrubs, and the forest floor where decomposition and nutrient cycling occurred in a nearly constant, warm darkness. Yet this same forest environment presented challenges. The soils of the tropical rainforest, despite the lushness of vegetation, are often poor in available nutrients, with most nutrients locked up in the biomass of living plants rather than in the soil itself. The warm temperatures and high moisture that support such rich plant growth also support the growth of fungi, bacteria, and insects that cause rapid decomposition and disease. Parasitic diseases carried by insects and water sources were endemic. The dense vegetation made construction and agriculture difficult. The seasonal distribution of rainfall, while generally abundant, could produce periods of severe moisture stress during the dry season. The Maya response to these environmental challenges included the development of sophisticated agricultural techniques, water management systems, and forest management practices that allowed them to support large populations without destroying the forest ecosystem entirely. One particularly important aspect of Maya environmental adaptation was the creation and maintenance of raised fields called Huacle Chan, or wet mountains, in areas with poor drainage or seasonal flooding. These features, which have been identified through a combination of archaeological fieldwork and remote sensing technologies like LiDAR that can reveal landscape features invisible from the ground, were constructed by piling up soil in raised beds separated by canals that allowed water drainage and transport. These raised fields were extraordinarily productive, as the soils in the raised beds were enriched by sediment and organic material deposited from the surrounding water, and by the deliberate addition of organic material like aquatic plants and forest vegetation. In some regions, raised fields were arranged in systematic patterns across extensive areas, suggesting a level of landscape engineering and environmental management that approaches the scale of the most ambitious modern agricultural systems. Water, in many ways, was the defining element of Maya civilization, and the various ways the Maya managed water resources reveal both practical ingenuity and deep spiritual significance. In the northern Yucatan Peninsula, where rainfall is less reliable than in the southern lowlands and surface water sources are scarce, the Maya developed elaborate systems of cisterns and reservoirs to capture and store rainfall. These features, called aguadas, were constructed by excavating depressions in the porous limestone and lining them with a plaster made from burned limestone called sascab, which sealed the surface and prevented water from seeping away into the permeable bedrock. In some cases, these aguadas covered areas of several hectares, capable of storing enough water to sustain a city through months of dry season when no rain fell. The construction and maintenance of these water systems required sustained labor and careful management. The plaster lining needed regular maintenance and repair. Silt and organic debris had to be periodically removed, and systems of aqueducts and canals had to be constructed to move water from the aguadas to residential and ceremonial areas. The cenotes, the natural sinkholes where the underground water table rose to the surface, or where the ceiling of underground rivers collapsed to reveal water below, held special significance in the Maya cosmological understanding. These were not merely practical water sources, but sacred places, thresholds between the material world and the spiritual realm, locations where offerings were made and ceremonies performed. The Maya believed that cenotes were dwelling places of Chak, the rain god, a being whose favor was essential to agricultural success and whose anger could bring devastating drought. In times of particular crisis, severe drought that threatened the survival of the community, pilgrims would travel, sometimes from great distances, to perform ceremonies at sacred cenotes, bringing offerings of precious goods, and sometimes engaging in bloodletting or human sacrifice to petition the gods for rain. Archaeological investigations of cenotes have revealed deposits of pottery, jade objects, obsidian blades, and in some cases skeletal remains of sacrificial victims, physical evidence of the religious importance of these locations. The sacred cenote at Chichen Itza is perhaps the most famous of these sites, a deep, water-filled sinkhole that has attracted scholarly attention since the 19th century. Early 20th century archaeologists dredged the cenote and recovered thousands of objects from the water: gold objects, pottery vessels, obsidian blades, jade ornaments, and human skeletal remains. The recovery of these artifacts provided concrete evidence of the practice of sacred offerings into cenotes, confirming what 16th century Spanish chroniclers had recorded. The cenote at Chichen Itza was connected by a raised stone causeway directly to the largest pyramidal temple at the city, Temple of Kukulkan, physically and symbolically linking the ceremonial heart of the city with this sacred place of water and divine presence. As we gradually approach the end of our historical exploration, we must address one of the great puzzles of Maya history: the dramatic decline and transformation that occurred at the end of the Classic period, around 900 of the Common Era. For reasons that archaeologists and historians continue to debate, the great cities of the southern lowlands, Tikal, Palenque, Calakmul, and many others, underwent a period of decline. The inscriptions on stelae, which had served as the primary public record of royal achievement and historical events, ceased to be erected. The construction of major ceremonial buildings slowed and then stopped. The elite hierarchy that had sustained these cities appears to have fragmented. The population of the cities decreased, and the jungle gradually began to reclaim the urban landscape. By 950 of the Common Era, the great centers of the Classic period were largely abandoned, their monuments covered by forest growth, their sophisticated urban systems no longer functioning. The causes of this collapse remain subjects of scholarly debate and investigation. Multiple factors appear to have played roles. A series of severe droughts, revealed through analyses of tree rings and lake sediments, may have stressed agricultural systems at a critical moment. Internal political conflicts and wars between competing city-states may have undermined the stability of the region, and the depletion of natural resources, particularly through unsustainable forestry practices, may have reduced the carrying capacity of the landscape. Likely the collapse resulted not from any single cause, but from the interaction of multiple stressors. Environmental change creating agricultural stress, which then led to conflict over scarce resources, which then further destabilized political systems and encouraged migration to other regions. The sophisticated administrative systems and the elaborate ceremonies that had maintained social cohesion appear to have broken down under this combination of pressures. Yet it is crucial to understand that the end of the Classic period was not the end of Maya civilization. The northern Yucatan Peninsula, which had been less densely populated during the Classic period, saw a resurgence of activity and growth. Cities like Chichen Itza, Mayapan, and Uxmal experienced their greatest growth and influence during the post-Classic period, from roughly 900 to 1500 of the Common Era. The Maya civilization transformed rather than collapsed. The political structures changed, the locations of power shifted, the artistic styles evolved, but the fundamental elements of Maya culture, the calendar system, the religious practices, the language, the agricultural systems, persisted and continued to develop. When Spanish conquistadores arrived in the 16th century, they found thriving Maya cities and complex political organizations. The conquest of the Maya regions took decades, with some communities resisting Spanish domination into the 19th century. And indeed, in the present day, millions of Maya peoples continue to inhabit the regions their ancestors occupied for thousands of years, maintaining many elements of traditional culture, language, and spiritual practices alongside modern influences. The northern Yucatan Peninsula, a region that had been secondary to the great lowland cities during the Classic period, emerged as the dominant center of Maya civilization during the post-Classic period. The transformation appears to have been rapid, beginning around 800-850 of the Common Era, decades before the full collapse of the southern centers. The development of this region was aided by several factors: the existence of cenotes and aguadas that provided reliable water sources, the positioning of northern cities along important maritime trade routes, and the initial period of population movement and migration that brought peoples northward as the southern centers declined. Among the most important of these northern cities was Chichen Itza, which rose to prominence during the 8th century and reached its greatest power and influence during the 10th through 12th centuries of the Common Era. Chichen Itza exemplifies the cultural transformation that occurred during the post-classic period. The city shows clear evidence of influence from central Mexico, particularly from the Toltec civilization, whose style and political structures appear to have been adopted by northern Maya rulers. The Temple of Kukulkan, the massive pyramid that dominates the ceremonial center of Chichen Itza, demonstrates this Toltec-influenced architectural style with its geometric precision and the serpent motifs that refer to Kukulkan, the feathered serpent deity that had central importance in Mesoamerican cosmology. This temple represents one of the most perfectly preserved pre-Columbian monuments, likely because its solid stone construction protected it from the decay that has affected many other sites. The pyramid contains a smaller pyramid within it, suggesting that it was built over an earlier structure, and archaeologists believe that interior pyramids at many Maya sites may have served a ritual function. The smaller pyramid inside might have represented the earlier world or era, enclosed within the newer structure. The ball court at Chichen Itza, one of the largest known, measures roughly 168 meters long by 70 meters wide, with walls 7 meters high. Stone rings set at mid-height on the walls served as goals for the ball game, and the scale of this court suggests that matches held here were events of major significance, drawing players and spectators from across the Maya world. The acoustics of the ball court are exceptional. A person speaking at one end can be clearly heard at the other end, despite the distance, an acoustic property that may have been intentionally engineered into the design. The carvings that decorate the ball court include depictions of the sacred ball game, showing teams of 7 players positioned to receive and hit the rubber ball. One particularly striking carved scene appears to depict a player whose head has been separated from his body, with streams of blood or vegetation emerging from the neck wound, interpreted by many scholars as a depiction of ritual sacrifice related to the ball game. During the post-classic period, the religious practices and cosmological understanding of the Maya underwent certain transformations, even as fundamental elements remained continuous with earlier traditions. The codices that survive from this era, including the Madrid Codex and fragments of others, reveal ongoing interest in astronomy, divination, and agricultural timing. The calendrical systems that had been refined during the classic period continued to be used and maintained. The architectural forms and artistic styles changed somewhat, reflecting influences from central Mexico and from the conditions of life in the northern Yucatan. But the underlying religious concepts that organized society remained recognizable continuities with the past. The Kuhul Ajau continued to be the fundamental political religious unit, with divine kingship remaining the legitimating force for political authority. The settlement pattern during the post-classic period also underwent changes. Rather than the pattern of a few massive ceremonial centers surrounded by residential zones, the post-classic saw the development of more distributed urban settlements with multiple smaller centers of importance, rather than single massive cities dominating regions. The reasons for this change are debated, but may relate to the shift toward maritime trade routes that connected coastal cities more directly with distant trading partners, reducing the advantages of a central ceremonial and administrative hub. Mayapan, which rose to prominence in the 13th century, was organized in a somewhat different way from the classic period centers. The city was surrounded by a defensive wall, one of the few pre-Columbian Mesoamerican cities to have such fortifications, suggesting that warfare and the need for defense had become more prominent concerns. Within the wall, houses of the nobility and of common people were distributed more densely than in earlier cities, suggesting a different form of urban organization. The role of merchants in the post-classic period appears to have increased. The maritime trade networks that connected the Maya world with more distant regions created opportunities for merchant groups to acquire wealth and influence independent of direct control by the Kuhul Ajau. Some evidence suggests that merchant groups formed their own associations and maintained their own religious practices and ceremonies. This emergence of merchant power may have contributed to certain changes in political organization during the post-classic period, rather than the authority of the Kuhul Ajau being absolute and unchallenged. The post-classic saw the development of more collective forms of governance in some cities, with councils of nobles and merchants sharing power with the ruler. Some scholars have interpreted this as a tendency toward more oligarchic political structures, a distribution of power among multiple elite factions rather than concentration in the hands of a single divine ruler. The northern Yucatan Peninsula, where the post-classic centers flourished, presented environmental conditions significantly different from those faced by the classic period lowland cities. The peninsula is characterized by a thin layer of soil overlying permeable limestone bedrock. Rainfall, while generally adequate, shows greater variability than in the southern lowlands, with periodic droughts presenting real challenges to agriculture. The forest vegetation is scrubby and lower growing than the magnificent rainforest of the southern lowlands, with less biomass supporting lower densities of wildlife. Yet the northern peninsula possessed certain advantages. The cenotes and aguadas provided reliable water sources for those who knew how to access them. The coastal areas offered access to marine resources and position on important trade routes. And the forest, while less dense and less biodiverse, was somewhat more manageable for human modification and cultivation. The agriculture of the northern Yucatan had to adapt to these conditions. While maize remained the fundamental crop, the cultivation of other crops may have been somewhat less reliable than in the south. The Maya of the north appear to have relied more heavily on maritime resources, fish, shellfish, sea turtles, manatee, and other aquatic creatures, than their southern counterparts. Salt production, which could be accomplished by evaporating seawater in shallow ponds, became an important economic activity that was traded inland. Honey production from the native Melipona bees, which do not have stingers and are easily managed in clay vessels, became a valued economic activity. The diversification of the economic base, with multiple products and resources contributing to the regional economy rather than agriculture being the sole basis of sustenance, may have contributed to the resilience of northern Maya civilization during the post-classic period, allowing it to thrive even when the environmental conditions that supported the southern lowland cities were failing. The organization of settlement in the north also adapted to the environmental conditions. Rather than the pattern of a single massive ceremonial center with smaller surrounding settlements, the northern cities developed patterns of multiple linked centers connected by roads and maritime routes, each with its own ceremonial precinct and administrative functions. This distributed pattern may have been better adapted to the environmental conditions of the peninsula, allowing for more efficient access to water sources and other resources. The maritime orientation of northern Maya civilization is evident in the architecture and placement of cities. Many northern centers have clear sightlines to the sea or are positioned on coastal promontories, whereas the great classic period centers were typically inland in the deep rainforest. As we approach the final chapters of our historical journey, The focus shifts toward the arrival of Spanish conquistadores and the end of independent Maya political authority. In 1502, Christopher Columbus encountered Maya merchants on his fourth voyage to the Americas, the first recorded contact between Europeans and the Maya people. These encounters were initially limited, with Maya merchant canoes meeting Spanish ships offshore. Over the next 2 decades, Spanish explorers and conquistadores gradually learned of the Maya territories and their political organization. In 1519, Hernán Cortés led an expedition that would first conquer the Aztec Empire of central Mexico. Following the conquest of the Aztecs, Spanish attention turned toward the Maya regions, which were geographically closer to Spanish settlements in Mexico and Central America than the more distant Maya regions of the southern lowlands. The Spanish conquest of the Maya regions was not rapid or unified. Different Spanish commanders launched campaigns into different parts of the Maya world over a period of decades. Some Maya cities, weakened by internal conflicts and warfare, fell relatively quickly to Spanish military technology and tactics. Others resisted Spanish domination for years or decades. The city of Uxmal appears to have been a focus of Spanish attention, with documents recording military campaigns and the establishment of Spanish administrative control in the region. By the 1540s, Spanish military conquest of the Yucatan Peninsula was largely complete, though organized resistance and rebellions would continue. The conquest of the southern highlands and forests was even slower, with Spanish conquistadores penetrating these regions only gradually and incompletely. The Spanish conquest brought not only military domination, but also profound cultural and spiritual transformation. The Spanish, particularly through the missionary efforts of Dominican and Franciscan friars, worked to convert the Maya population to Christianity. This conversion was not a simple replacement of Maya religion with Christianity, but rather a complex process of syncretism in which elements of traditional Maya religion and cosmology were incorporated into Christian practice and belief. The sacred cenotes, believed to be dwelling places of Chak and sites of ritual importance, were sometimes associated with Christian saints. The ancient gods were sometimes equated with Christian figures, allowing communities to maintain some continuity with their religious traditions while nominally converting to Christianity. The elaborate Catholic calendar of saints' days and religious festivals created structures for ritual action and community gathering that resembled the ceremonial calendar that had structured Maya life for centuries, allowing for a degree of cultural continuity, even as the explicit religious content was transformed. The Spanish colonial period brought fundamental changes to Maya society, yet also witnessed the remarkable persistence of Maya culture and identity through the centuries of colonial rule. The political structure of the Kuhul Ajau and the dynastic system was dismantled, replaced by Spanish administrative structures, including appointed governors and tribute systems that enriched Spanish settlers and the crown. The great ceremonial centers, with their pyramids and temples, fell into disuse as colonial Spanish authority prohibited the public practice of Maya religion. Yet many Maya communities maintained their traditions secretly, in household ceremonies and in the forests away from Spanish surveillance. The calendrical systems, the mythological narratives, the understanding of time and cosmos that had been encoded in hieroglyphic texts, were maintained through oral transmission, careful memorization, and in some cases, through the continued keeping of codices hidden from Spanish authorities. The introduction of Christian churches into Maya communities represented another form of cultural synthesis. Many of these churches were constructed in areas where temples had previously stood, literally rebuilding the sacred geography of communities around Christian rather than Maya religious structures. Yet the Maya communities often incorporated elements of their worldview into the use and understanding of these Christian spaces. The significance of the four cardinal directions, so fundamental to Maya cosmology, influenced how churches were oriented. The ritual significance of blood sacrifice was sometimes transformed into the Christian sacrament of communion, understood through Maya cosmological frameworks as a form of sacred feeding of the divine. The Christian cross, which resembled the Maya symbol representing the center of the world and the four directions, was readily incorporated into indigenous belief systems. The Spanish authorities were concerned about the maintenance of pre-Columbian religious practices among the Maya and attempted to eliminate the practice of human sacrifice and other elements they viewed as particularly offensive. The destruction of temples and the suppression of ceremonial centers succeeded in eliminating public, large-scale ritualism centered on divine kingship. Yet many Maya communities maintained smaller, more intimate ceremonies in household contexts and in remote locations away from Spanish oversight. The practice of bloodletting, which had characterized royal and priestly ceremony during pre-Columbian times, diminished but did not entirely disappear, transmuted into folk practices and folk beliefs that persisted into modern times. The knowledge contained in the codices was partially preserved through the efforts of Maya nobility and scribes who, despite the Spanish prohibition of the traditional writing system, worked to maintain and copy these sacred texts in Spanish alphabetic transcriptions of the Maya language, often including Catholic Christian elements alongside the traditional Maya cosmological content. The survival of the Maya language, despite 4 centuries of Spanish colonial rule and centuries more of modern national governments, represents one of the most remarkable achievements of Maya cultural persistence. The Spanish authorities made efforts to impose Castilian Spanish as the language of the colonial territories, but the geographic dispersal of Maya communities, the difficult terrain, and the relative remoteness of many communities limited the effectiveness of these efforts. The Maya language, rather than being a single unified tongue, actually comprises a family of related languages, with different communities speaking distinct variants that sometimes possessed limited mutual intelligibility. This linguistic diversity meant that Spanish could not easily serve as a universal language of communication, even within the Maya territories. Communities maintained their own languages through generations of teaching children the ancestral tongue within household contexts, maintaining the language through oral tradition, ritual use, and daily communication. The written form of the Maya language underwent significant transformation during the colonial period. The traditional Maya hieroglyphic writing system, which had been maintained in carved forms on stone monuments and in the elaborate codices, was suppressed by Spanish authorities. Some argue that Spanish suppression contributed to the discontinuation of the tradition of hieroglyphic writing, which had already declined during the post-classic period and was maintained only among a highly specialized elite. However, the phonetic sophistication of the Maya script, its ability to represent the sounds of the language through syllabic signs, meant that it could be readily adapted to represent the sounds of the Maya language using the Spanish alphabet. Maya scribes and scholars who learned to read and write in the Spanish alphabet began to produce texts in Maya language written in alphabetic form. These texts included religious materials adapted to Christian teachings, historical narratives, land records, and other practical documents. The most famous of these alphabetic texts is the Popol Vuh, the creation narrative of the Quiché Maya of Guatemala, which was likely recorded in alphabetic form in the 17th or 18th century, preserving a version of what had previously been transmitted orally and through hieroglyphic texts. The recovery and decipherment of the hieroglyphic writing system in modern times has been a remarkable scholarly achievement that has transformed our understanding of Maya civilization. During the 19th century, pioneering scholars like John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherwood brought attention to the ruins of Maya cities and attempted to interpret the hieroglyphic inscriptions carved on monuments. The 20th century saw gradual progress in decipherment, with scholars like Tatiana Proskuriakov making the crucial discovery that the inscriptions recorded historical events and dynastic records rather than purely religious or astronomical content. The breakthrough in understanding the phonetic components of the script came through comparative linguistic work and experimentation in the 1950s and 1960s, eventually leading to the recognition that many of the signs represented not just words, but also syllabic sounds. By the final decades of the 20th century, sufficient portions of the script had been deciphered that scholars could read hieroglyphic texts with reasonable confidence and precision. This recovery of literacy has transformed our understanding, revealing dynastic histories, religious beliefs, astronomical calculations, and daily life as recorded by the Maya themselves. Today, millions of people identify as Maya, maintaining languages, cultural practices, and traditions that represent direct continuities with pre-Columbian civilization, while also incorporating centuries of change and adaptation. The Maya languages, while facing pressures from Spanish, English, and other larger languages, continue to be spoken by millions of people across the region. Young Maya people grow up bilingual or multilingual, typically learning their ancestral language at home, while also learning Spanish or other languages for education and broader communication. Community organizations throughout the Maya regions work to document and preserve Maya languages, creating educational materials, supporting traditional knowledge keepers, and working to ensure that future generations have access to these fundamental expressions of cultural identity. The calendrical traditions that were developed and refined over thousands of years of Maya civilization continue to be maintained by indigenous priests and practitioners, known by names like Daykeeper or AJ Kijab in different Maya languages. These practitioners maintain awareness of the 260-day Maya calendar, noting which day in the cycle falls on any given date, and understanding the spiritual and practical implications of living within the rhythms of this sacred calendar. The practice of making offerings at sacred sites, cenotes, mountain peaks, and other locations understood to hold spiritual significance continues in many Maya communities. The agricultural cycle, while transformed by modern technology and commercial agriculture, still maintains elements of the ancient traditions. Many Maya farmers continue to make offerings before planting, observe traditional wisdom about proper timing for cultivation, and maintain ceremonial practices connected to the planting and harvest seasons. The spiritual beliefs of the Maya, transformed through centuries of Christian influence, but retaining recognizable elements of pre-Columbian cosmology, continue to structure the religious lives of many Maya people. The saints' days of the Christian calendar have been incorporated into indigenous ceremonial practice in ways that create continuity with earlier traditions. The central role of water, the significance of mountains, the understanding of the world as layered with different spiritual realms. These remain central to Maya worldview even in the modern era. The transmission of knowledge about medicinal plants, traditional crafts, and other traditional practices continues through family teaching and community apprenticeship, maintaining forms of knowledge that may trace their lineages back centuries or millennia. The scientific study of Maya civilization through archaeology has accelerated dramatically in recent decades, with new technologies and methodologies revealing previously unknown aspects of Maya history and society. Remote sensing technologies like LiDAR, light detection, and ranging have revolutionized archaeological understanding by revealing landscape features invisible from the ground, ancient causeways, agricultural terraces, residential compounds, and water management features that had been hidden beneath centuries of forest growth and agricultural modification. These technologies have revealed that the population of the pre-Columbian Maya civilization was far larger than previously imagined. What scholars once estimated as a few million inhabitants may in fact have numbered in the tens of millions. These discoveries have required archaeologists to reconsider the scale of Maya achievement and to recognize that the civilization sustained some of the highest population densities of any pre-industrial civilization. Collaborative archaeology, in which scholars work with contemporary Maya communities and involve community members in archaeological investigation, research design, and interpretation, has become increasingly common and has enriched archaeological understanding. Contemporary Maya people often possess cultural knowledge, traditional narratives, and understanding of landscape features and practices that inform and enhance archaeological interpretation. Archaeological work that respects Maya sensibilities and incorporates Maya perspectives on their own history has led to deeper and more nuanced understanding of the past. Some archaeological sites have been repatriated to or placed under the management of indigenous communities, allowing for forms of engagement with the past that honor Maya values and perspectives. The study of environmental change and ancient climate, using techniques like pollen analysis, tree ring dating, and analysis of lake sediments, has provided new insights into the relationships between environmental conditions and social change in Maya history. The evidence for severe droughts corresponding to periods of social disruption has led to new understandings of environmental stresses and their role in shaping historical processes. These scientific investigations, combined with archaeological evidence and textual sources, are gradually building a more complete and sophisticated understanding of Maya civilization in its environmental context. As we drift toward the final moments of this long journey through Maya history, it is worth reflecting on what Maya civilization represents and why it continues to capture scholarly and popular imagination more than 5 centuries after Spanish conquest. The Maya developed a sophisticated understanding of mathematics, including the concept of zero, hundreds of years before this concept appeared in Europe. They developed astronomical knowledge so precise that their calculations of the length of the solar year were more accurate than those of the contemporary European scientific tradition. They created a writing system that could represent their language with precision and subtlety, allowing for the recording not only of practical information, but of literary, historical, and religious thought. They built magnificent cities in one of the world's most demanding environments, creating structures that have survived centuries of exposure to climate, seismic activity, and neglect. Yet the significance of Maya civilization extends beyond these measurable achievements. The Maya represent a model of how human societies can adapt to environmental challenges through ingenuity and respect for natural limits. The agricultural systems they developed, the milpa, the raised fields, the forest gardens, represent forms of land management that, while modified through the centuries, continue to sustain agriculture in the Maya regions and are increasingly recognized by modern sustainability experts as models for environmentally responsible food production. The calendrical and astronomical knowledge represents a form of scientific inquiry that developed independent of European traditions and yet achieved comparable or superior precision in specific domains. The spiritual traditions and religious worldviews, while transformed through history, represent profound reflections on humanity's relationship to the natural world, the cosmos, and the divine. The persistence of Maya civilization through centuries of colonialism, marginalization, and ongoing pressures is itself a testament to the resilience of culture and the power of traditions to adapt and continue. Millions of people continue to identify as Maya, continue to speak Maya languages, continue to practice traditions that trace their lineages back centuries or millennia. The study of Maya civilization offers not only historical and anthropological insights, but also contemporary lessons about sustainable living, intellectual achievement, cultural persistence, and human dignity and resilience in the face of enormous historical pressures. As we face contemporary challenges of environmental change, cultural loss, and the pressures of globalization, the history and continuing reality of Maya civilization offer profound insights and inspirations for understanding alternative ways of organizing society and being in the world. As night deepens around us, and as this long journey through the history of the Maya draws toward its gentle conclusion, we might reflect on what we have encountered across these hours of exploration. We have walked through the forest paths of the ancient Maya world, smelled the dampness of the tropical air, understood the challenges and opportunities presented by this remarkable environment. We have considered the sophistication of the calendrical systems, the precision of astronomical observations, the elegance of mathematical concepts embedded in architecture and art. We have contemplated the religious worldview that understood the cosmos as a vast, interconnected web of relationships between the human realm, the spiritual realm, and the natural world. We have followed the rhythms of agricultural seasons, understood the ritual significance of water and sacred sea notes, witnessed the grandeur of temple cities rising from the forest. We have traced the transformation of Maya civilization from the height of the classic period through the flourishing of post-classic centers, through the encounter with Spanish conquistadores, through centuries of colonial rule and ongoing adaptation and persistence. The story is not one of a civilization that simply collapsed and disappeared, replaced by modern peoples with no connection to the past. Rather, it is a story of transformation, adaptation, resilience, and the remarkable capacity of human cultures to maintain continuity even through profound historical disruptions. The Maya civilization continues today in the millions of people who identify as Maya, who speak Maya languages, who maintain traditions and practices that trace their origins back centuries and millennia, who engage with the legacy of their ancestors even as they navigate the contemporary world. The study of Maya civilization opens doorways to understanding not only the past, but also the present and future possibilities for human societies. The achievements of the Maya in mathematics, astronomy, writing, and engineering demonstrate human capacity for intellectual and creative achievement that is not limited to any particular civilization or geographic region. The environmental knowledge and adaptive management practices developed by the Maya over centuries of experience offer lessons for contemporary challenges of sustainability and environmental stewardship. The religious and spiritual worldviews, grounded in deep respect for natural cycles and cosmic order, present an alternative to modern assumptions about human dominion over nature. The persistence and dignity of Maya people in the face of centuries of marginalization and ongoing challenges offer inspiration for understanding human resilience and the power of cultural identity. Tonight, as this narration drifts toward silence and sleep draws near, know that across the Maya territories and throughout the world, the legacy of this remarkable civilization endures. In the stone monuments still standing in the jungle, in the languages still spoken by millions of people, in the traditions still maintained in households and communities, in the continuing work of Maya people to honor their heritage and shape their futures, the civilization lives on. The questions we posed at the beginning of our journey, about astronomical knowledge, about architectural achievement, about the wisdom that allowed a civilization to thrive in demanding environments, have revealed themselves not as mysteries, but as natural expressions of human creativity, ingenuity, and spiritual depth. The Maya civilization, in all its complexity and sophistication, remains a testament to what is possible when human societies live in dialogue with their environment, organize themselves according to cosmological principles, and commit themselves to the pursuit of knowledge and the creation of beauty. May this journey through history bring peace to your mind as night deepens, and may the rhythms of time that structured the lives of ancient Maya peoples, the turning of calendars, the rising and setting of stars, the cycles of seasons and growth, continue to remind us of the deep patterns that connect all human experience across time and across the earth.